The mornings in Jung-ho's town always began the same way, gray, cold, and heavy with silence. The cracked loudspeakers mounted on the street poles blared the same patriotic anthem every dawn, reminding everyone that their duty to the leaders came before their own hunger. For most people, that meant trudging toward factories or fields. For Jung-ho, it meant standing before bronze giants. He carried a wooden bucket filled with cloudy water and a rag so thin it was almost see-through. His job was simple, or so the officials said: keep the statues spotless. In truth, it was impossible. The statues of Kim Jong-un towered above him, carved into permanence, yet the air itself seemed to conspire against him. The dust from unpaved roads, the soot from chimneys, even the flakes of rust from broken railings, all found their way to the bronze faces. Jung-ho's task was to erase nature itself, and failure was not an option. He had seen what happened to those who failed. A year earlier, another man who polished a smaller statue was accused of mocking the great leaders, when officials noticed faint streaks of grime left behind. That man was dragged away by Korean soldiers in the middle of the night. His wife wept quietly as neighbors shut their doors, pretending not to hear. The man's children vanished soon after, whispered to have been sent to a labor camp. Jung-ho never forgot the way fear hung in the air that night, heavier than the dust he scrubbed every day. As he reached up with his rag, stretching until his back ached, he thought of his wife, Sun-hee, and their daughter Minji. They were at home in their one-room shack, probably boiling weeds or bark to stave off hunger until he returned. His daughter was only 8, her cheeks sunken, her eyes far too old for her age. Sometimes he wondered if polishing these statues wasn't only breaking his body, but betraying them, devoting his strength to bronze instead of his own blood. But betrayal wasn't a choice he could make. Korean soldiers often stood nearby, rifles slung across their shoulders, watching as he worked. They said nothing, yet their silence was louder than shouts. Their eyes measured him constantly, as though they could see into his mind. One wrong look, one pause too long, one gesture of frustration, they would not hesitate to drag him away. When the sun rose higher, its light struck the bronze faces, making them glisten like fire. Jung-ho squinted, wiping furiously, his cracked hands stinging from the cold water. Dust still clung stubbornly to the folds of the statue's coats. He felt the weight of it, not just the physical dust, but the meaning of it. Each speck was a test. Each streak a potential death sentence. He worked in silence, heart pounding, every stroke of the rag a prayer that today the dust would show mercy. By the time the noon whistle echoed through the city, Jung-ho's arms felt like lead. The statues gleamed in patches where he had scrubbed hardest, but no matter how much he wiped, he could still see faint shadows of dust clinging to the bronze. His heart tightened. If an inspector noticed even a trace, it would be his end. Every month, party officials came with notebooks in hand, circling the monuments as if hunting for flaws. Behind them, Korean soldiers stood stiff and silent, their rifles gleaming in the same sun that made the bronze glow. One official had once crouched to the ground, running a finger along the base of a statue.
Ow.
When it came away gray, the man responsible for that sector was seized on the spot. Nobody saw him again. That memory lived in Jung-ho's mind like a scar. No. Today was not an inspection day, but fear in North Korea never worked by schedule. Fear was permanent, like the statues themselves. As Jung-ho dipped the rag back into the bucket, he caught his reflection in the water. His face was worn, lines carved deeper than his 35 years should allow. His stomach growled so loudly he feared the nearby Korean soldiers might hear, but they didn't flinch. Hunger was normal. Hunger was invisible. Hunger was expected. He thought of Sun-hee. She used to smile often back when their marriage was new and their stomachs were full enough to laugh after dinner. Now, she rarely lifted her head. She spent her days searching for scraps, bark, roots, sometimes corn husks left rotting in the fields after harvest. Last winter, their neighbor boiled leather shoes just to survive. Jung-ho wondered if his family would face the same fate this year, but still every morning he bowed before the statues before beginning his work. Not out of belief, but out of fear. He knew the Korean soldiers watched for sincerity. The party taught that statues were living symbols of the leaders, and to polish them without reverence was as much a crime as neglect. Once, when Jung-ho's back had stiffened and he hesitated to bow deeply, He felt a shadow fall over him. A Korean soldier's hand gripped his shoulder, firm and cold, pressing him lower until his forehead nearly struck the ground. "You will bow as if you mean it," the Korean soldier said. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the threat. Since then, Jong-ho had learned to bow with careful precision, lowering his body with practiced grace, even while his knees shook from hunger. He knew that in this land, survival was not just about finding food, it was about hiding every flicker of despair from the eyes that watched. As the sun lowered in the sky, he wiped the last streaks of dust from Kim Jong-un's outstretched arm. His arms trembled, his legs stiff, but the statues shone again for now. He gathered his rag, his bucket, and his aching bones, whispering the same silent prayer he whispered every day. "Please, let this be enough." By the time Jong-ho returned home, dusk had swallowed the sky, and the alleys of his neighborhood were filled with silence. Silence was safer than laughter here. Too much noise might attract the wrong ears, and in North Korea, wrong ears were everywhere. His house was no more than 2 rooms stitched together with crumbling plaster and patched wood. A weak fire flickered in the clay stove, casting trembling shadows across the walls. Sun-hee sat hunched in the corner, her eyes hollow, her fingers peeling bark she had managed to find near the riverbank. The smell of boiled bark had become their dinner. "Appa!" cried little Yoonmi, rushing to hug his legs. Jong-ho bent down, lifting his daughter into his arms. She was only 6, but her body was as light as a bird's wing. He pressed his cheek against her thin shoulder, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. "Did you eat?" he asked Sun-hee softly. She shook her head. "There wasn't enough. Me needs it more." Jong-ho's chest ached. Every day was a battlefield between hunger and love always lost first. He set Yoonmi down and pulled the small cloth sack from his pocket. Inside was a single stale corn cake he had bartered for with a piece of cloth from his old shirt. Sunny's eyes widened with both relief and fear. "Where did you get this?" She whispered sharply. If someone saw, no one saw. Jong-ho cut her off, though his own heart pounded. Trading, even for scraps, was a crime punishable by prison or worse. The Korean soldiers patrolled markets and alleyways, dragging away anyone caught bartering outside state rations. He had once seen a man beaten in the street for carrying rice hidden in his shoes. They broke the corn cake into 3 uneven pieces. Jong-ho insisted his family take the larger shares, though he was starving. He chewed his portion slowly, savoring it like a feast, as if pretending could fool his stomach. When Yoonmi drifted to sleep in her mother's lap, soon he whispered, "Jong-ho, how much longer can we live like this?" The question cut him deeper than hunger. He thought of the statues he polished every day, shining symbols of power towering over their crumbling lives. He thought of the Korean soldiers' eyes on him, waiting for the smallest mistake. He thought of the whispers he had heard families who disappeared in the night after being accused of disrespect. And then he thought of escape, words so dangerous it could not even be spoken aloud. To dream of leaving was treason. To even imagine it was enough to destroy them all. Still, as he watched his daughter's fragile chest rise and fall, he felt the word burn inside him like fire. Escape. But fire was dangerous here. One wrong spark, and it could consume not just him, but everyone he loved. That night, Jong-ho lay awake listening to the creak of the wind outside. Every sound felt like footsteps. Every shadow felt like a knock at the door. In North Korea, danger did not sleep. It waited. The next morning, the pounding of boots echoed down the narrow street. Jong-ho froze, spoon still in hand. The sound was unmistakable Korean soldiers marching, their voices sharp, their rifles slung across their backs like extensions of their authority. "Inspection," Sunny whispered, her voice trembling. She grabbed Yoonmi and held her close, as if her arms could shield the child from the entire regime. Inspections were dreaded. They could come at any hour, announced or unannounced, and no family was ever truly ready. Korean soldiers entered homes, searching for anything suspicious for objects. Hidden food, torn newspapers with the leader's image damaged. Even dust on portraits could be interpreted as disrespect, and disrespect was death. The pounding stopped at their door. A heavy fist struck the wood, rattling it on its weak hinges. "Open." Jong-ho hurried forward, his hands slick with sweat. He pulled the door wide, bowing deeply. 3 Korean soldiers stepped inside. Their boots left muddy prints across the fragile floor, their eyes sweeping over everything with cold precision. "Stand aside," one barked. They turned the room upside down. The stove was kicked open, the mats lifted, the walls tapped for hollow spaces. One soldier reached for the sack in the corner where Zhang Ho had hidden a few crumbs of bark. Sunny's breath caught, but when the Korean soldier found only dust and scraps, he sneered and tossed it aside. Then came the portraits. 2 framed images of the leaders hung on the wall, their glass cloudy. Korean soldier stepped forward, running a gloved finger across the frame. When he pulled it back, the faintest trace of dust clung to the tip. The room fell silent. "Dust," the Korean soldier said coldly, holding out his finger like evidence of a crime. "Do you think your loyalty is clean, worker?" Jung Ho's knees nearly buckled. He bowed so low his forehead brushed the floor. "Forgive me, comrade. I polished them yesterday, but the wind." Silence. The Korean soldier's shout cracked like a whip. The great leaders deserve perfection, not excuses. For a moment, Zhang Ho was sure they would take him. He imagined being dragged into the street, beaten until he couldn't stand, his family forced to watch. He felt Sunny's eyes on him, begging him not to falter. Uni whimpered, too young to understand the danger, yet sensing the terror in the room. Finally, after a long, suffocating pause, the Korean soldier lowered his hand. "Clean it again. If we return and find a speck your entire family will pay." They left as suddenly as they had come, the door slamming shut behind them. The house was in ruins, their belongings scattered, but at least they were still alive. Zhang Ho collapsed to his knees, his body shaking with the weight of relief and humiliation. Sun Hee pulled Uni close, her eyes wet with silent tears. It was not just hunger that starved them in North Korea. It was fear. Fear that lived in their walls, in their air, in their very breaths. Fear that no amount of bowing or cleaning could ever erase. The market was forbidden, yet it was the only place where life pulsed with desperate energy. Officially, only state-issued goods were to be sold, but everyone knew that under the watchful eyes of the regime, barter and whispers of forbidden trade kept families alive. Zhang Ho entered cautiously, his steps measured. He carried a tiny pouch of acorns and dried roots, pitiful offerings, but enough to perhaps exchange for a handful of rice. Sun Hee had begged him not to go, afraid of Korean soldiers who patrolled the stalls. But hunger was a sharper master than fear. The air was thick with the smell of boiled corn, smoke, and human sweat. Women sat on mats, offering whatever scraps they had, used shoes, scraps of cloth, even a single potato cut into slices. Every transaction was done in murmurs, eyes darting constantly for signs of uniformed boots. Zhang Ho paused at a stall where an older woman displayed a small pile of rice. His stomach clenched at the sight. "How much?" he whispered. Her eyes narrowed, scanning him. "3 times what you carry." He swallowed hard. It was always too much. But before he could bargain, a sudden shout cut through the noise. Inspection. Korean soldiers flooded into the market, rifles slung, eyes sharp. Panic scattered like sparks in dry grass. Women shoved goods under their mats, men turned their backs, and children darted into the alleys. Zhang Ho froze. The pouch in his hand felt heavier than iron. If they searched him and found unauthorized trade, he would vanish into the camps. He thought of Sun Hee and Yunmi waiting at home with nothing to eat. He couldn't let this be the end. He slipped into the shadow of a tattered stall curtain, crouching low. A soldier's boots pounded just meters away. "Legal trade will not be tolerated," the man barked. "Those who betray the motherland betray our great leader." A young boy was dragged forward, no more than 12, clutching a stolen potato. The boy cried out, swearing he had taken nothing, but a soldier struck him across the face. The crack echoed in the market's silence. Zhang Ho's heart pounded. He wanted to look away, but he forced himself to watch. This was the price of a mistake, a lesson carved into the flesh of the people. The boy's mother screamed, but she was silenced with the butt of a rifle. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, the Korean soldiers moved on, leaving broken stalls and broken spirits behind. Zhang Ho dared to breathe again. He slipped the pouch back into his pocket, realizing he would go home empty-handed. His family would eat nothing tonight, but they would still have him. As he walked away, he heard a whisper from a nearby trader, almost too soft to catch. There are safer ways, if you have courage. Jong Ho didn't ask what the man meant, but the words clung to him like a spark in the dark, a dangerous promise of something more than survival. That night, the market's chaos replayed endlessly in Jong Ho's mind. He saw the boy's swollen cheek, the mother's scream, the boots of the Korean soldiers pressing down on ordinary lives. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it came filled with nightmares of being dragged away, Sun-hee and Yoon-mi left behind in silence. The next morning, while repairing a neighbor's broken stove, in exchange for a few handfuls of cornmeal, a stranger approached him quietly. The man's face was weathered, his voice low, careful. "You were at the market yesterday," he said, his tone more statement than question. Jong Ho stiffened, afraid he had been exposed. "I was only looking." The man raised a hand. "I'm not here to accuse you. I'm here to warn you." His eyes darted around to ensure no one was listening. "The Korean soldiers are watching more closely now. Too many whispers of people trying to leave." Jong Ho's heart skipped. The words hung in the air like forbidden fruit. Leave, even thinking it was dangerous. "Ow. Why tell me this?" he whispered. "Because you look like a man desperate enough to try, and desperate men make mistakes." Before Jong Ho could respond, the stranger moved on, blending back into the gray crowd, as if he had never been there. That evening, as Jong Ho sat with Sun-hee and Yoon-mi over their meager meal, he could not shake the man's words. He looked at his daughter's hollow cheeks, her small fingers clutching her bowl, as if it held gold instead of watery broth. Could they truly escape this life, or was it just another trap, another way for the regime to catch the desperate? Later that night, he ventured outside, the air brittled with cold. A group of Korean soldiers marched down the street, their rifles reflecting the dim light of the lamps. Jong Ho pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. From inside the houses, curtains shifted as neighbors peeked through, eyes filled with the same mix of fear and curiosity. One of the Korean soldiers barked, "Tomorrow, there will be inspection rounds. Those who fail to report, those who behave suspiciously," his gaze swept the street like a blade, "will be dealt with." Jong Ho's stomach clenched. The stranger's warning was not empty. The net was tightening, and soon there would be no room to breathe. When he returned inside, Sun-hee noticed his pale face. "What is it?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then lied. "Nothing, just tired." But in his heart, he knew it was something bigger than fatigue. Something that might demand choices he wasn't ready to make. Choices that would risk not only his life but the fragile lives of those he loved most. The warning was clear. Survival was no longer about food alone. It was about staying invisible, about knowing when to bow and when to whisper, and perhaps when to run. The morning air carried a sharp bite as Jong Ho lined up with his neighbors for the inspection. The square was crowded, hundreds of men, women, and children standing in neat, nervous rows. The Korean soldiers paced before them, rifles slung across their shoulders, boots echoing on the frozen ground. Jong Ho felt Sunny's trembling hand slip into his. Beside her, little Yoon-mi tried to imitate the posture of the adults, her eyes wide with confusion. Jong Ho squeezed his wife's hand reassuringly, though his own palms were damp with sweat. The inspection began. Korean soldiers shouted names, demanding proof of loyalty, asking questions no one dared answer incorrectly. One wrong word, one hesitation, could mean prison or worse. When it was Jong Ho's turn, a stern-faced officer narrowed his eyes. "You polish the statues, don't you?" "Yes, comrade," Jong Ho replied, bowing low. "And yesterday you were at the market?" Jong Ho's heart hammered. Had someone reported him? He kept his head lowered, only to look comrade. "I had nothing to trade." The officer studied him for a long, unbearable moment. Finally, he grunted and waved him on. Relief washed over Jong Ho, but it was fleeting. He had seen the officer scribble something in his notebook. That night, the atmosphere in the neighborhood grew heavier. Whispers passed from door to door, warning of disappearances. A family 2 streets away had been taken in the middle of the night, dragged out by Korean soldiers for anti-state behavior. No one dared ask what that behavior was. Jong Ho tried to stay calm, but unease gnawed at him. Someone had noticed him at the market. Someone had whispered his name. He remembered the stranger's warning. They are watching more closely now. As he sat in the dim light of their single candle, Sun-hee asked quietly, "Do you trust our neighbors? Jong-ho hesitated. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. Even family could turn against you if it meant survival. I don't know anymore, he admitted. At night he awoke to the sound of footsteps outside. He froze, listening as heavy boots stopped near their door. His breath caught. The silence that followed was worse than noise. After a few minutes, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. But Jong-ho knew. They were being watched. The next morning, Yoonmi asked innocently, "Appa, why do the Korean soldiers always come to our house?" Jong-ho forced a smile, his heart breaking at her innocence. "Because they want to make sure we're safe," he lied. But he knew the truth. Safety no longer existed for them. Every day was borrowed time. Every smile, every bow, every word had to be perfect. It could be the end. The shadow of betrayal hung heavy, pressing on his chest. Somewhere someone had marked him. The question was not if the Korean soldiers would come again, but when. The days following the inspection stretched into a suffocating blur. Jong-ho tried to live as though nothing had changed. He polished the statues, bowed in the square, and recited the slogans with the same forced enthusiasm as everyone else. Yet beneath his calm mask, his heart was a constant storm. He could feel the eyes on him, though he never knew whose. "At night, son," he whispered her worries while Yoonmi slept beside them. "What if they come back, Jong-ho? What if they take you? What will become of us?" Voice trembled like the flame of their candle. Jong-ho wanted to reassure her, to promise safety, but he couldn't. Instead, he whispered, "We must stay silent. Say nothing to anyone. Do not even let your face show fear." Silence was their only shield, but silence carried its own weight. One afternoon, as Jong-ho walked home from polishing, he found his neighbor, Mrs. Choi, waiting by the alley. Her cheeks were hollow from hunger, her eyes darting nervously. "They're saying the Korean soldiers are looking into your family," she whispered. "Be careful." Jong-ho's stomach twisted. "Who told you that?" She glanced away. "I heard it from someone. Don't ask who. Just be careful." That night, son, he pressed him. "We must leave, Jong-ho, before they come." But Jong-ho shook his head. "If we leave, it proves guilt. If we stay, perhaps they forget." His voice cracked on the last word, for he knew the regime never forgot. The tension grew unbearable. At dawn, the rumble of trucks echoed through the neighborhood. Korean soldiers climbed down, banging on doors, shouting for families to line up. Jong-ho felt Sun-hee's nails dig into his arm as they obeyed. A commander read from a list, dragging names into the open. Whole families were taken, their cries muffled by the roar of boots. Jong-ho's chest tightened with every pause, every name called. When the commander's finger trailed down the page and moved past his name, Jong-ho nearly collapsed with relief. His family was spared this time. But the sound of his neighbors being herded into the trucks would haunt him forever. That night, Yoonmi asked, "Why are they taking people, Appa?" Jong-ho couldn't answer. He pulled her close, holding her tiny frame as though she might vanish from his arms. His silence was his only response. Lying awake long after his family slept, he stared at the cracked ceiling. Silence had saved them once, but he knew it would not save them forever. Each day was another gamble, another borrowed hour. He realized then that survival was not about living, it was about enduring. Enduring the hunger, the fear, the silence that ate at his soul. And yet beneath all the despair, a seed of defiance stirred. If silence could no longer protect them, perhaps only action could. The days after the raid hung over the village like a funeral shroud. Jong-ho could still hear the screams of his neighbors in his mind, the sound of children torn from their parents, the muffled sobs as families were shoved into trucks. The silence that followed was worse, an emptiness that pressed down on every house, every street. For Jong-ho's survival no longer felt like enough. He polished the statues each morning, bowing until his spine ached. Yet his thoughts wandered to the families who had vanished. He wondered if they were in camps, if they were alive, if they still remembered what sunlight felt like. At home, Sun-hee grew quieter. She cooked thin porridge with trembling hands, watching Yoonmi's small body shrink with each passing week. "She needs more, Jong-ho," she whispered one night. "If she weakens, she won't survive another winter." Jong-ho's chest ached at the truth. He could not rely on rations. The government gave nothing but starvation. He would have to find another way. But every risk was deadly. Korean soldiers patrolled more often now, their boots echoing against the cracked pavement. Anyone caught hoarding food, anyone caught trading, anyone caught whispering the wrong words could disappear overnight. Still, Jong-ho felt something shifting inside him. I had been silent his entire life, a man shaped by fear. Yet now, with his daughter's life slipping away, silence felt like surrender. One evening, as the streets emptied under curfew, he wandered to the river's edge. The water moved sluggishly beneath the dim glow of the moon, carrying with it secrets of those who had tried to escape. Jong-ho crouched low, running his hands through the wet soil. Here, hidden beneath the earth, a thought came to him. If the Korean soldiers controlled the streets, the checkpoints, the trucks, then perhaps the ground itself could be his passage. He returned home, his eyes sharper than they had been in weeks. "Son," he noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked, searching his face. Jong-ho hesitated, then whispered, "There may be a way." "Not yet, but one day soon." She stared at him, fear battling against a flicker of hope. "Jong-ho, if you are wrong, they will take us all." "I know," he said quietly, "but if I do nothing, they will take us anyway." For the first time in years, he felt the faintest spark of control. It was fragile, dangerous, but it was his. Hidden deep inside, Jong-ho's resolve began to grow, not just to endure, but to fight in his own way, to carve out a chance at survival where none was meant to exist. The silence that had once protected him was now replaced with something far stronger: resolve. The morning of inspection arrived like a storm. Jong-ho had worked through the night, scrubbing the statue of the great leader, until his hands bled. His reflection glimmered faintly on the bronze surface, but all he could see was his fear staring back at him. Around him, villagers swept, polished, and bowed in silence. Everyone knew that even a speck of dust could mean punishment not just for them, but for their families. The Korean soldiers would not hesitate to drag an entire household away if dishonor was suspected. As the sun rose, a convoy of black cars rolled into the square. High-ranking officials stepped out, their stiff uniforms pressed to perfection, eyes sharp as knives. Behind them, Korean soldiers lined up in formation, rifles gleaming. Jong-ho's heart thundered in his chest as the officials approached the statue. His arms trembled at his sides, his breath shallow. For hours he had polished every inch of the monument. He had prayed, begged, pleaded with fate. But then, as the breeze shifted, the sunlight revealed it. A thin layer of dust, carried by the night wind, resting gently on the statue's shoulder. The lead official's face darkened. He gestured sharply. Korean soldiers stepped forward, boots pounding against the stone square. Who was responsible for this statue, the official demanded. Silence spread across the crowd like a plague. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. But everyone knew the answer. Everyone's eyes turned to Jong-ho. His knees weakened. Sun-hee, standing in the crowd with Yoon-mi in her arms, stifled a cry. The Korean soldiers seized Jong-ho, their grip iron on his arms. He did not resist. He did not plead. Instead, he looked once more at his wife, at his daughter, her fragile face pressed against her mother's chest, her eyes wide with confusion. "I did everything I could," Jong-ho whispered, his voice cracking but steady. "Remember that." Officials did not care for his words. To them, he was already guilty. To them, his failure was betrayal. The crowd bowed their heads as Jong-ho was dragged away, his footsteps echoing against the square. The statue gleamed in the sunlight, dust and all, untouched by the fear it caused. For Jong-ho, there was no escape, not from poverty, not from hunger, not from the gaze of the regime. His attempt at survival, his love for his family, his hidden resolve, all ended beneath the shadow of the very monument he had spent his life polishing. As the convoy departed and the square emptied, the dust settled once again on the bronze surface. A quiet reminder that no matter how much one wiped, scrubbed, or bowed, the truth could never be erased. In the silence that followed, Sun-hee held Yoon-mi tighter, knowing they would now carry the burden alone.
Ow.
The dust would return, always, just as fear always returned. But so too, in some small corner of her heart, would the memory of Jong-ho's final act of love, enduring everything until he no longer could.